Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dan Palazzolo from the Department of Political Science and the Marshall Center, and I want to welcome you to our first speech of this year for the Marshall Center. You may have gotten a pamphlet. If you haven't, there should be one near your seat. You can see some of the lectures that we're having later on in the year. But we're very excited today and pleased to have Mr. Roger Kimball, who is a notable art critic and social commentator. He's a native of Maine, and he got his undergraduate degree at Bennington College and spent a little bit of time at Yale. And if during the question and answer session you want to find out his experience at Yale, you might want to ask him and ask him about where things wound up. It's quite an interesting story. I read a few things about him on the internet, and it's the first time I've met Roger. And I was going to put find some pithy quote or something to put into the introduction, but I couldn't find one because there are so many interesting things that he has to say, and I think you'll find that this afternoon to be very, very interesting. He's currently editor and publisher of the new Criterion and president and publisher of Encounter Books. He's also an art critic for the National Review and written a regular column in PJ Media. He's the author of numerous books, most notably Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Higher Education. I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't read the book. Gary asked me to make this introduction last week, and I'm looking forward to reading it, because I am a tenured professor. Whether that qualifies me as a tenured radical remains to be seen. He also contributes frequently to a number of publications, most notably the New Criterion, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times Books Review, Commentary, The Spectator, and the National Review. Today, his talk is back on the road to serfdom, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Roger Kimball.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in Richmond, my first time here. Beautiful, beautiful place. Well, in October 2008, shortly before that year's fateful presidential election, Barack Obama famously told a crowd of admirers that they were only a few days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. Now that phrase has haunted me for 6 years. I believe that those who describe this Tuesday's elections, as a referendum on Obama were correct. After all, come January, the Republicans will have more seats in the House of Representatives since 1928. The Senate will be comfortably in Republican hands, and there will be nearly twice as many Republican governors as Democratic governors. Yet, to hear the president tell it, nothing much happened on Tuesday. He told the press the next day that he did not feel repudiated, and on Wednesday, during his press conference, it was quite clear that he was mildly irritated, but also sullen and defiant about the election. I'll come back to the president's message in due course. For now, I want to linger over that 2008 promise, or maybe it was a threat. Fundamentally transform the United States of America. What could that mean? At the moment he spoke, the United States was the richest, the mightiest, the freest, the most secure republic in the history of the world. If someone wanted to come along and fundamentally transform it, could he succeed without impinging on one or more of those achievements? Now, of course, people say a lot of things on the campaign trail. Many things they don't really mean. So one question would be, how serious was Barack Obama when he spoke about fundamentally transforming the country? Well, I believe that the last 6 years have shown beyond cavil that he was in deadly earnest. What former Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels called Obama's shock and awe statism has gone a long way toward transforming the country most fundamentally, toward changing its status as a world power, its economic vibrancy, its hospitableness toward business and entrepreneurship, and above all, perhaps, its commitment to limited government and individual liberty, what the preamble to the Constitution of the United States called the blessings of liberty. How astonishing, for example, that the state should propose to fine you if you do not choose to acquire a health insurance plan deemed suitable by the IRS or some other federal agency. How amazing that the state in America should oust the head of a private corporation, that it should tell banks how much they may pay their employees or use taxpayer-funded subsidies to reward people for buying a certain brand of car from a company partially owned by the United States government. Now, these are extraordinary innovations, dangerous to the ideal of limited government, I would argue, and dangerous, too, to the life of freedom. The critical issue revolves around the proper relationship between the individual and the state in a modern democracy. Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's former chief of staff, made headlines when he declared in the midst of the 2009 economic meltdown that you never want to let a serious crisis go to waste. What he meant was that a crisis makes people feel anxious and uneasy. And that is a good time to exploit that anxiety and push through initiatives that might otherwise not be able to be pushed through. But I think that there are good arguments to be made that a period of crisis is one where one should be extra prudent, especially guarding against being hasty. As the British politician and journalist Dan Hannan observed, most disastrous policies have been introduced in times of emergency. Consider the precipitate actions of the New Deal Democrats under FDR. Today, I think many commentators acknowledge that their sudden expansion of government and proliferation of burdensome new business regulations hampered business, retarded new hiring, and prolonged the Depression. Amity Shlaes, in her book about FDR, has a lot to say about that. FDR and his minions, Hannan note, were in the grip of one of the most dangerous of political fallacies. The idea that at a time of crisis, the government's response must be proportionate to the degree of political anxiety. But a prudent government, on the contrary, ought to temper that anxiety with dispassionate judgment. How often have you heard a politician or government bureaucrat that doing nothing is not an option? In fact, as Hannan rightly observes, doing nothing is always an option, and often it is the best option. This was something that Calvin Coolidge, perhaps America's most underrated president, acknowledged when he said to a busybody aide, "Don't just do something, stand there." Now, the point is that it is far, far easier to establish than rid oneself of any bureaucracy. And of all mankind's many bureaucracies, the hardest to kill are government bureaucracies. When the economic crisis broke in the fall of 2008, the United States was quick off the mark to spend more, to borrow more, to intervene more in business, and imposed a raft of paralyzing new regulations. Over the past 6 years, President Obama has greatly expanded the size and intrusiveness of the federal government. He has spent trillions of dollars, and has, under the rubric of health care reform, put almost 20% more of the American economy under the control of Washington. I think ruefully of Thomas Jefferson's advice that, quote, "To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must make our election between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. Which will it be?" Back in 2010, after an earlier electoral shellacking, to use President Obama's term, the president several times pleaded with his opponents to put politics aside. Now, I know that there is a cynical interpretation according to which this admonition was merely Chicago-style political hypocrisy, and perhaps that's partly the case. But I think there was something much more to that, much more than hypocrisy involved. I think that President Obama was entirely sincere about that. Like many friends of humanity, Barack Obama believes that politics are what his opponents, those whom he once in an unguarded moment described as his enemies, engage in. His occupation, you see, is less politics than benevolence. He wants to help people. He said this in his press conference several times on Wednesday. Essentially, he believes, he has already put politics aside. Admittedly, it might sometimes be necessary to indulge in politics to get things done. But basically, he believes, his goal transcends politics, that whole grubby realm of politics and back and forth and compromise and so on. He believes that he occupies a realm of virtue that may guide politics, but is not subject to politics' selfish imperatives. Thus, when it comes to tax policy, for example, President Obama has said that the chief issue is not raising revenue, but fairness. He just wants, as he famously told Joe the plumber, to spread the wealth around. Never mind that it's not his wealth to spread. The president's use of the term fairness brings me to a subject that may seem only distantly related to my subject, the new road to serfdom that we seem to be traveling down. But I think actually that it's absolutely central. I mean rhetoric. What Aristotle, who devoted an entire book to the subject, described as the art of persuasion. That's what rhetoric is, the art of persuasion. Now today I think we tend to regard rhetoric, to the extent that we think about it at all, as something superficial. A rhetorical question is one that expects no answer. While to describe something as merely rhetorical is to say that it is concerned only with style or emotional effect, not substance. Yet Aristotle was right, I believe, in thinking that rhetoric was par excellence the political art. The art, I mean, that helps us negotiate our shared lives together as intermittently rational actors with competing visions of the good. And here's the question. Here's a question of rhetoric that is not a rhetorical question. Why do liberals enjoy a virtual monopoly on the rhetoric of virtue? Why is that? Why do they have all the nice words? Now, a full answer to this question would detain us for a long time and take us back at least to that earlier smarmy faux liberal Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But for now, I wish merely to observe the curious irony that there are few more illiberal ideologies abroad in the world today than the agglomeration of attitudes and assumptions that currently go under the term liberal. I forget the name of the wit who observed that in today's world, the liberal dreams of a society in which everything that is not prohibited is mandatory. Is that liberal? It's the same with other aspects of illiberal liberalism. Its partisan command the heady rhetoric of virtue, but the results of their campaigns are reliably disappointing. Your mother doubtless told you about the unprofitable destination of the road that is paved with good intentions, and the fatuousness of good intentions, unanchored by the realities of human nature, is part of the tragic comedy that is modern liberalism. But let's not overstate the purity motivating our liberal masters. In pursuing their agenda of liberal abstract benevolence, they make us all collaborators in an agenda of dependency. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, to take one example, is very interesting in this regard. It was deployed with all the rhetorical blandishments of liberal sanctimoniousness. But what was its issue? What did it actually achieve? As the late, great James Q. Wilson put it, the war on poverty did not abolish poverty. It institutionalized it. This melancholy spectacle has repeated itself time and again in Western societies, and yet we hitherto have seemed incapable of profiting from the lesson. I think of that old liquor ad that was on the side of buses at one point. In life, it read, "Experience is the great teacher." In Scotch, "Teachers is the great experience." I'm not so sure that that's true. I'm not so sure that we have shown that we profit from experience. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. Think about the words fairness, liberal, compassion, benevolence. They're all such comforting words. But what do they really portend? Barack Obama is a type of the benevolent leader, not the most thoroughgoing type. America has so far been spared that, thank God, but a representative specimen nonetheless. Of course, we are all inclined to assume that benevolence is a good thing. But think about it. Really, benevolence is a curious mental or characterological attribute. It is, as the philosopher David Stove observed, less a virtue than an emotion. To be benevolent means what? What does benevolent mean? To be disposed to relieve the misery and increase the happiness of other people. Whether you actually do that or not is secondary. Yes, as Stove says, benevolence, by the very meaning of the word, is a desire for the happiness rather than the misery of others. But here's the rub. The fact simply is that its actual effect is often the opposite of the intended one. The adult who has been hopelessly spoiled in childhood is the commonest kind of example. That is, someone who is unhappy in adult life because his parents were too successful when he was a child at protecting him from every source of unhappiness, and thus preventing him from growing up. It's not that benevolence is a bad thing per se. It's just that, like charity, it works best the more local are its aims. Enlarged, it becomes like that telescopic philanthropy that Dickens in Bleak House talked about. He has a character there called Mrs. Jellyby, a lady of very remarkable strength of character who devotes herself entirely to the public. She has devoted herself, says Dickens, to an extensive variety of public subjects at various times, and is at present until something else attracts her, devoted to the subject of Africa. Now, like other such benefactors, Mrs. Jellyby's philanthropy is more ardent the more distant and abstract it is. Her own children are in rags. When it comes to her own family, she's just not there. Now, the sad truth is that theoretical benevolence is compatible with any amount of practical indifference, or even, for that matter, cruelty. You feel kindly toward others. That's what matters, your feelings. The effects of your benevolent feelings in the real world are secondary. Rousseau was a philosopher of benevolence. He had 6 children out of wedlock and promptly gave them to the orphanage to be raised. Was that a good thing to do? Yet he was full of the emotion of virtue for everyone. Now, Karl Marx was a philosopher of benevolence. Yet everywhere that Marx's theories have been put into practice, what follows is universal immiseration, nearly universal immiseration. The nearly is important because there are always that cadre of elites entrusted with managing the state-sponsored benevolence who tend to escape the misery that is visited upon others. But the thing to note is that Marx's intention was the benevolent one of forging a more equitable society by abolishing private property, by, to employ the president's famous phrase again, spreading the wealth around. Every Marxist society has spread it wide and spread it thin by coercive measures from the government. I think in this context of Ronald Reagan's observation that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." The great 19th century English essayist Walter Bagehot underscored this point. It is a melancholy occupation, observed Bagehot, to ask whether the benevolence of mankind actually does more good than ill. It makes the purveyor of the benevolence feel better, that is, more self-righteous, but it is unclear whether the objects of benevolence are really any better off. And so it is with the modern welfare state, a sterling incarnation of the sort of abstract benevolence that David Stove had in mind. It doesn't matter what the welfare state actually does, whether it creates more of the poverty and dependence that it's technically supposed to be combating. Its intentions were benevolent, and that's what people keep coming back to, which is one of the reasons why it's so seductive. It flatters the vanity of those who espouse it, even as it nourishes the egalitarian ambitions that have always been at the center of enlightened thought. And that's why David Stove describes benevolence as the heroine of the enlightened. It's intoxicating, addictive, expensive, and ultimately ruinous. The intoxicating effects of benevolence help to explain the growing appeal of politically correct attitudes about everything from the environment to the fate of the third world. Why does consistent failure of statist policies not disabuse their advocates of the statist agenda? One reason is that statist policies have the sanction of benevolence. They are against poverty, against war, against oppression, for the environment. And why shouldn't they be? Where else are the pleasures of smug self-righteousness to be had at so little cost? The intoxicating effects of benevolence also help to explain why unanchored benevolence is inherently expansionist. The party of benevolence is always the party of big government. The imperatives of benevolence are intrinsically opposed to the pragmatism that underlies the allegiance to limited government. Stove's argument is that the union of abstract benevolence, which takes mankind as a whole as its object, with unbridled moralism, is a toxic, misery-producing brew. Of course, as Stove goes on to note, this lethal combination is by no means peculiar to communists. It provides the emotional fuel for utopians from Robespierre to the politically correct bureaucrats who preside over more and more of our Western institutions today. They mean well. They seek to boost all of mankind up to their own plane of enlightenment. Inequality outrages their sense of justice. They see tradition as the enemy of innovation, which they embrace as a lifeline to moral progress. They cannot encounter a wrong without seeking to right it. The idea that some evils may be ineradicable is anathema to them. The notion that the best is the enemy of the good, that many choices are to some extent choices among evils rather than between good and evil, that proverbial wisdom seems to them quaintly out of date. The result is a campaign to legislate virtue, to curtail eccentricity, to smother individuality, and to barter truth for the current moral or political enthusiasm, whatever it may be. Now, for centuries, political philosophers have understood that the lust for equality is the enemy of freedom. That species of benevolence underwrote the tragedy of communist tyranny. The rise of political correctness has redistributed that lust over a new roster of issues. Not the proletariat anymore, you don't hear about him, but the environment, the struggling masses, not the struggling masses, but reproductive rights, gay rights, the third world, diversity training, an end to racism and xenophobia. So, and it looks like Marx's famous mot, history repeating itself, not as tragedy this time, but as farce. The trouble is that this farce isn't funny. Since January 20th, 2009, we have seen that President Obama was utterly in earnest about transforming the United States from a country devoted to democratic capitalism and individual liberty into a kind of socialist regime in which egalitarianism, not individual freedom, provided the guiding principle. One of the president's primary tools to accomplish this has been money, that ubiquitous but deeply mysterious power that is both one of the world's greatest engines for liberty, but also, when frustrated, an awful tool of enslavement. Now, I would be the first to acknowledge that I don't really understand money. It's a very complicated phenomenon, but we can see its effects. And when it comes to money, President Obama seems curiously divided in his mind. On the one hand, he's not averse to spending it, gobs and gobs of it, millions, billions, trillions. There's always more, he seems to think, where that came from. It's sort of the spigot theory of economics. You just turn the lever, you turn the lever of government authority, and wow, out pops all this money. It's amazing. As I say, though, money for the president is the great tool, the great weapon, even, of social reconstruction. There are piles and piles and piles of it about it. All he needs to do to fulfill his dream is take some from your squares here and move them over to other squares named things like fairness over here. On the other hand, though, President Obama seems deeply suspicious of money. He seems to believe that it carries a kind of moral taint, especially when any significant amount of it finds its way into the hands of ordinary citizens. I don't mean to suggest that he has any objection to money personally. Clearly he thinks it's okay that his wife pads off for a photo op at a local soup kitchen in sneakers that cost $540, and he doesn't blanch at all at multi-million-dollar vacations paid for by the taxpayers, or hopping aboard Air Force One to go to the latest fundraiser down the street. But in the larger sense, that is, when he thinks about society as a whole, he deprecates wealth and the acquisitive instincts that make its accumulation possible. At some point, he famously said, "I think you've made enough money." Who or what, I wonder, vouchsafed him the standard for that judgment? It seems to me that there's a lot to be said for what Anthony Trollope said in his novel, Can You Forgive Her? He put into the mouth of his character, Plantagenet Palliser, the following. Responding to a character who bragged that he lacked mercenary tendencies, Palliser observes that there is no more vulgar error, that is to say, common or erroneous, as that by which men have been taught to say that mercenary tendencies are bad. A desire for wealth is the source of all progress. Civilization comes from what men call greed. Let your mercenary tendencies be combined with honesty, and they cannot lead you astray. Thus Trollope. I think he was right. And I believe that abandoning the philosophy of mercenary tendency, rightly understood, if I may allude to Tocqueville, is a prescription not only for the impoverishment, but also the immiseration and ultimately for the soft tyranny of democratic despotism, to allude to Tocqueville again. I know that President Obama is not alone in dissenting from this view. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to mention him again, shared his suspicion of wealth, as of course did Karl Marx and countless other would-be benefactors of mankind. But who in the end has benefited mankind more? The capitalist, with his wealth-producing mercenary tendencies, or the do-gooder, who deprecates wealth, at least in others, for the sake of some higher good? Who's done more good for the world? A few years ago, when the Obama administration took over General Motors and forced out GM's chairman Rick Wagoner, one commentator spoke of the, quote, tectonic change in the relation between business and government that this action tokened. Time was the role of government in a capitalist society was primarily to secure an environment in which private enterprise could thrive, kept the playing field level. It enforced contracts. It enforced the rule of law. It stayed out of your life. Well, today the role of government is increasingly to nationalize private enterprise, i.e. to destroy it in the name of a higher good. What President Obama has called, with Orwellian piquancy, a new era of responsibility, in which government bureaucrats tell you how to run your business, whom to employ, and how much to pay them. A tectonic change in the relationship between business and government. Remember that phrase. And note that a tectonic, that is, a fundamental change between business and government, is also a tectonic change between the individual and government. What our generation has forgotten, Hayek noted in The Road to Serfdom, is that the system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less so for those who do not. The tectonic change in the relationship between business and government, between the individual and government, signals not only the expansion of government control, it also signals the contraction of individual freedom in the name of what President Obama has called fairness. From the very beginning of his campaign, of his first campaign, President Obama made it clear that economic fairness was his political lodestar. But what if by fairness the president meant not impartial justice, but equalized outcomes? What then? Who can doubt, Hayek asked, that the power which a multiple millionaire, who may be my neighbor and even my employer, has over me is so very much less than that which the smallest bureaucrat possesses, who wields the coercive power of the state, on whose discretion it depends, whether or not I may be allowed to live in a certain place and where I may work. Anyone who's had any dealings with the IRS, for example, or the DMV knows what Hayek was talking about. The chapter in The Road to Serfdom in which these words appear is called Who Whom? The question that, Lenin said, was the fundamental fulcrum of politics. Who whom? Hitherto, the genius of the American system has been to short-circuit that brutalizing question by distributing the power of the subject. Lenin's who is no longer a central and centralizing authority, but a multiplicity of actors, each with his native interests and prerogatives. Edmund Burke spoke of the importance to liberty of the little platoons that claim our daily allegiance. James Madison, in Federalist 51, made a similar point when he observed that, quote, the policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives helped encourage the distribution of power and hence the growth of liberty. The tectonic change contemplated by the Obama administration would have us disband those little platoons and assimilate ourselves to the swarming army of the state. Madison's opposite and rival interests for these collectivists impede the progress of fairness and interrupt the process of equalizing wealth. Earlier in the Federalist, Madison observed that there were, quote, two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. Madison thought it self-evident that both courses, being inimical to liberty, spelt disaster. He believed that the protection of that diversity of faculties, which underwrote the diversity of property, was the first object of government. Our current masters in Washington seem to disagree. They seem willing to experiment with both expedients that Madison warned against in order to achieve their egalitarian goals. One of the most depressing things about all these government expropriations is the fact that they operate like a one-way ratchet, always undermining freedom and extending the control of the state, never going the other way. Once the government sinks its teeth into you, it's extremely difficult to wiggle free. The income tax and Social Security, remember, were introduced as temporary emergency measures. That's why 1895 is one of my favorite years in American history, because that was the year that the Supreme Court ruled that income tax was illegal. That didn't last very long. Ultimately, I suspect, President Obama is ostentatiously committed to what he calls healthcare reform, not for medical, but for political reasons. By appropriating another sixth of the U.S. economy, he will not help Americans live longer or lead healthier lives, but he certainly will greatly extend the government's prerogatives over the details of your daily life. And this brings me to another aspect of the president's program. There is, he said, a moral imperative to health care. Is there? Is that the state's responsibility? What he meant, I think, was that if you happen to agree with him and his proposal, you're an upstanding citizen who deserves the warm, self-regarding glow of moral infatuation. But if, on the other hand, you disagree with him, you are a greedy, selfish, unenlightened person who needs, well, he hasn't gotten around to that part of the equation yet, but you can be sure that you'll get plenty of government attention. Now, there's another side to Obama's curious relationship to money that I want to mention. I mean his apparently incurable addiction to debt. As I write, I looked up just the other day, the federal debt alone is approaching $19 trillion. $19 trillion. That's an unimaginable number unless you happen to be a physicist or some other mathematical genius. And I won't depress you by totting up all of the other debt we are suffering, the unfunded liabilities, because that adds up to more money than there is in the entire world, actually. It made me resonate strongly to Mitch Daniels' description a while back of the new red menace we face, the red menace of debt. Now, I thought other people were waking up to this too, when some months back I saw a bumper sticker that said, "It's a good thing that Obama doesn't know what comes after trillion." But now I'm confused. It was not so long ago that the president assured us that no matter what else you've heard, we don't have a spending problem. I hope you're as relieved as I am by that assurance. I'll say no more about debt. Instead, I wanted to meditate very briefly on the political philosopher James Burnham and his observation that civilizations tend to die from suicide, not from foreign imposition. The historian Arnold Toynbee made a similar point, as indeed did Abraham Lincoln. If destruction be our lot, Lincoln wrote in the perpetuation of our political institutions, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Now, of course, suicide is a dramatic word. Applied to the life of nations, it tends to describe not a single event, but a process. There is rarely an existential equivalent of Hamlet's bare bodkin with which to put a sudden end to a sea of troubles. The diminutions are more protracted, and at the beginning, anyway, less obvious. My point is that those who live through a revolution, especially one that is largely pacific, as this has been so far, generally cannot discern the radical changes that are taking place in the world around them until the revolution is nearly complete. Then they find to their chagrin that many basic assumptions that they had entertained about the nature of society and their place in it have changed utterly. Now, I believe that we are living through some such revolution right now, today. The chief issue at stake in this revolution, as I said, is the relationship between the individual and the state. That, in a word, is the primary challenge to America's greatness. For that relationship between the individual and the state is up for fundamental renegotiation in a way that is unprecedented in this country. How that negotiation concludes will determine many things about the way we live our lives, from the way we get health care, educate our children, to the way we are allowed to conduct business, and the way the nation is constrained to conduct its foreign policy. The founders of this country, geniuses that they were, envisioned this assault on individual freedom that I have described. They knew this was a possibility. They knew that democracy, in which the demand for freedom was always in tension with the demand for equality, was peculiarly susceptible to the perversion of bartering freedom for the sake of security, or at least the illusion of security. Hence, the many, quote, auxiliary precautions the Constitution devised to safeguard freedom. Alexis de Tocqueville, genius that he was, described the metabolism of the depredations the founders feared as democratic despotism, which works not by tyrannizing men, but by infantilizing them, by making them ever more dependent upon a government that improperly arrogates to itself the task of deciding how they should live their lives. It is important to understand that the ideas percolating down from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and Capitol Hill are not new. That, indeed, is one of the depressing things about the new statism we face. It inspires a sense of what the philosopher Yogi Berra called déjà vu all over again. We've been down this road before. We know where it leads. It is that forlorn byway that Friedrich Hayek called the road to serfdom. Do we really have to go down it again? For decades, the United States has been drifting toward the shoals of that enslavement. The devilish genius of this form of tyranny, the commentator Michael Ledeen pointed out a while ago, is that it looks and even acts democratic. We still elect our representatives, and they still ask for our support. We act out our democratic skits while submitting to an oppressive central power that we ourselves have chosen. The element of seduction here that is so central to this kind of managerial despotism is one of the things that makes it so hard to resist. Hayek reminds us that the upsurge of socialism in a society has internal as well as external aspects. Socialism is not only something that the state does to individuals, it is also something that individuals do to themselves when they decide that freedom is too expensive to fight for and that the consolations of dependency are worth the tax on individual liberty. Hence my talk of suicide. The biggest challenge we face is not to our stock portfolios or 401k accounts, but rather to the psychological conditions for political liberty, among which a spirit of individual initiative, that is, the habit of taking responsibility for oneself and one's family, figure prominently. As Hayek observed, the most important change which extensive government control produces is a psychological change, an alteration in the character of a people. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't, in a modern democracy, go to bed free on Friday and wake up in chains on Saturday. It takes, Hayek notes, perhaps 1 or 2 generations. Where do you suppose we are in the process? The crucial point, Hayek says, is that the political ideals of a people and its attitude toward authority are as much the effect as the cause of its political institutions under which they live. This means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty, such as we enjoy, is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. In a characteristically penetrating observation, the commentator Mark Stein cites the deliciously awful spectacle of former Prime Minister Gordon Brown endeavoring to come up with a patriotic British equivalent to July 4th, Independence Day. What did his government turn up? July 5th, as it happens, the anniversary of the inauguration of the National Health Service. A fitting symbol, I think, of British surrender of personal freedom for the sake of spurious security. They can call it, Stein said, Dependence Day. Such statist initiatives tell the depressing story, but they do not tell the whole story. Even the increasingly gloomy Mark Stein points to a way out. He is quite right that you cannot wage a sustained ideological assault on your own civilization without profound consequences. We've had the assault and we're living with the consequences. But Stein is also right that without serious course correction, we will see the end of the Anglo-American era and the eclipse of the powers that built the modern world. The hopeful part of that prediction comes in the apodosis. The course may still be corrected. As Hayek noted about his own dire diagnosis, quote, the consequences can of course be averted if, note the conditional, if the spirit of liberty reasserts itself in time. There are, I believe, 2 main sources of hope. One lies in the past, in the depth and strength of America's traditional commitment to individual freedom and local initiative against the meddlesome intrusion of any central authority. That tradition is under siege, but as the existence of gatherings such as this attest, it's far from extinguished. Second main ground for hope lies in the immediate future. In the United States, we have lately witnessed a new revolt of the masses, different from the socialistic eruption Jose Ortega y Gasset limned in his famous essay on the subject. You might say that a specter is haunting America, the specter of freedom. It travels under different names, but its core motivation centers around the rejection of business as usual, the big government, top-down, elitist egalitarianism practiced by both major parties in the United States. In the aftermath of the November 2010 midterm elections, I spoke on a cruise sponsored by National Review, at which the pollster Scott Rasmussen observed that one thing the election demonstrated was that the American people do not want to be governed by Democrats or by Republicans. They want to govern themselves. If he is right, there's that little word if again, if he is right, then the challenges to America's greatness will themselves face potent challenges. Tuesday's election, I think, issued a sharp rebuke to the agenda of dependency promulgated by Barack Obama and his administration. When expatiating on such melancholy subjects, I like to take some solace in Lord D'Abernone's observation that an Englishman's mind works best when it's almost too late. And Americans too, I'd wager. But the sullen defiance of Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and others on the Democratic side of the ledger, coupled with the immense damage already done to the U.S. economy, the integrity of our borders, our military infrastructure, and our place on the world stage, make me wonder. Was Tuesday enough to divert us from the new road to serfdom? I do not know the answer to this. But as the weeks and months unfold, I suspect that more and more people will be waking up to the wisdom of James Madison's observation in Federalist 44 that, quote, In the last resort, a remedy must be obtained from the people who can, by the election of more faithful representatives, annul the acts of the usurpers. Thank you. And I'd be glad to take questions, comments, animadversions, recipes. Yes, sir.
Recently, my class watched Peter Thiel's interview with Bill Kristol on innovation and stagnation.
Yeah.
He was highly critical of higher education.
Yes.
Basically, he said he saw in higher education a lack of critical thinking and the pushing of the graduates into this sort of private-public bureaucracy, whether it's in the corporations or in public service, with very little room to think through problems and that. A, do you agree roughly with that? And what does higher education need to do to get itself back on track to help move the country forward?
So the question was, I was told to repeat the question. I will sort of try to nutshell it. The question was, the gentleman's class recently watched an interview between Bill Kristol, the editor of the Weekly Standard, and Peter Thiel, the entrepreneur, about higher education. And Peter Thiel's very critical of the institution of higher education in this country. He thinks it's become moribund, slave to political correctness, too expensive, and basically not worth the price of admission. What do I think? Do I think he was right? And what can higher education do to contribute to the progress of society? Is that a fair praise? So I think that Peter Thiel is right. I think that what we are seeing now is not all that dissimilar from what the Dutch saw in the Golden Age, when tulip prices, you could buy a house for the cost of one tulip bulb. There was this incredible bubble, tulip bubble. Eventually, of course, it burst, and people were left, with nothing. Those who had invested in the tulip bulbs. Glenn Reynolds, the commentator, has written a whole book about this. The higher, actually, he includes lower education as well, but he thinks that there is not only a financial bubble, but also a kind of intellectual bubble, that K through 12 education, which has different problems, but also higher education, have become sclerotic backwaters that because of their addiction to public funding and reliance on public unions in many cases have become unsustainable. And he quotes the economist Herb Stein, who says that which cannot go on forever won't. I think that that's right. If asked what we should do specifically about education, I would say we need to return to what education is really all about. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, no conservative, did note that education by its very nature was conservative because it was concerned fundamentally with taking the past and transmitting it to the future. That is a conservative operation. I think that's what education should do. I was talking with someone before we all got here today about today's students. My son just started high school, and he's no genius by any means, but he's interested in history, and the stories he brings back from his classmates are pretty appalling. People who cannot locate the Civil War in the right half century. They don't know who Winston Churchill was. Someone here said that he had a picture in his office of Margaret Thatcher petting a dog, and the student came over and said, "Oh, who's that? Whose dog is that?" Had no idea it was Margaret Thatcher. I mean, the ignorance is stunning. The more money we spend, it seems the less we get. So I would say, people should study Latin. They should read Homer. They should read Plato. Higher education should be, a very sort of traditional kind of thing. I think that Charles Murray was 100% right in his book Real Education when he said that the explosion of so-called liberal arts institutions in this country has been detrimental to the country because it has given people at great expense a pseudo-education and prepared them for nothing. What we need, Murray suggests, is a to remove the stigma from vocational education, let those few students who really want to pursue a liberal arts education do that, and then teach people real skills, real world skills. I think that would be another component of what, if I were asked what to do, I would say it's a long subject. What should one do about education? But there are two ideas. Yes, sir.
Now, is it Dr. Kimball?
No, absolutely not. No.
All right, well, it was very eloquent, so I assume Dr. But Mr. Kimball, thank you so much for your time. You mentioned the notion that there is a backlash that kind of occurs from that encroaching hand of central government, that comes upon a people. And with that kind of backlash, I know throughout the talk you mentioned a lot of the more fiscal conservative elements. Where do you see the future of social conservatism?
Okay, so the questioner asked, I mentioned a lot of fiscal items in my talk, but he asked, where do I see the future of social conservatism? Well, it's been my observation that issues like abortion or latterly gay marriage, issues like that are mostly sticks with which the left beats up the right, because they have managed to frame the discussion in such a way that rhetorically inept conservatives feel that they have to answer a question that is really not pertinent. I mean, if somebody's running for president, his position on, gay marriage is, as far as I'm concerned, completely irrelevant. I mean, what I want is somebody who can manage the country, who understands the economy, economics is not about the redistribution of wealth, but the creation of wealth, who understands that the president's primary responsibility above everything else is to protect this country, things like that. So, I think that there's been a lot of unfortunate polarization over these issues, that they're used as wedges to divide rather than unify. And I think that, I'm all for reestablishing the privacy of private life. I think that would be a good idea if one's private life were once again private, which it's not now. So that's not really an answer to your question, but it's at least a response. Yes?
What's going on in the art world that you can talk to us about?
Okay, the question is what's going on in the art world that I can comment on. Well, Andy Warhol once said that art is what you can get away with. And I think his own career was a kind of illustration of that point. The art world is not to be confused, in my view, with the world of art. I know that sounds paradoxical, but they really are two different things. The art world is that world of composed of celebrity, money, snobbery, and the nimbus, the romantic nimbus of transcendence that still attaches to the artistic project that people batten on in order to infuse this basically sociological phenomenon with at least the patina of artistic interest. The world of art, on the other hand, is painters and sculptors and musicians and poets just getting on with what they do. That is to say, painting and sculpting and composing and playing music and so on. The former, I think, is in a very powerless state. The art world. It's speaking of bubbles. There's, how long will the Jeff Koons that you just paid $30 million retain its value? Not very long. Not very long. And it's too bad because, art is an important thing in the civilization. You can tell a lot about a civilization by the seriousness, the nobility, the depth of its art. well, who are some of our most famous artists? Jeff Koons, I mentioned, Damien Hirst, the Chapman brothers. You know, it's not a very uplifting crew. And of course they say, well, they're challenging, you know, your bourgeois assumptions about X, Y, and Z, or they're transgressing the borders of something, which is ridiculous. All of the moves that these people have made were made at least as far back as Marcel Duchamp. In fact, he pioneered both main currents of artistic fascists. On the one hand, he produced his ready-mades. You know, he would take a bottle rack or a snow shovel and exhibit it, and people say, "Oh my gosh, that's what? Who knew?" And you know, so this is the kind of the banality. You know, art as banality. So now you have people who they do the same sort of thing, but they exhibit a crushed car instead. And then on the other hand, he was also no stranger to outrage. In was it 1913? I think he exhibited a urinal and called it Fountain, and this was scandalized taste. So that was thought, you know, that was just as upsetting at the time as Robert Mapplethorpe was in the 1980s. So you know, this stuff it's not challenging anything except the credulity of a misinformed public. You know, the idea that these guys are avant-garde or somehow challenging or transgressing things is disproved by the fact that no matter who it is, if it's Jeff Koons or the Chapman brothers or Robert, you know, let's say they're exhibiting at the Museum of Modern Art, than which there is no more established institution in New York, no more Tony institution, no richer institution. The opening night, there's the artist, and there's the black tie clad crowd of the donators and supporters happy to hobnob with them. So the art world, I think, is not doing so well, but there are plenty of good artists around. So. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the role of special interest as we move towards a correction, if we get any kind of correction? Your comments about the academic community, I can hear the howls from the tenured section, and it goes across the whole paradigm of our economic system.
Right. The question is, what's the role of special interests going to be as we move forward in this spectacle? Well, you know, I often wonder about the preceding adjective about many substantives. So, for example, when people talk to me about social justice, I always wonder, well, what does the addition of the word social add to the word justice? Does it make it better somehow? Does it, you know, does it fuzzier? Or, you know, social justice is better than ordinary justice. I mean, they're synonyms, really. It's just, the addition of the adjective is just a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand to introduce a few more emotional red corpuscles into the word. And I think, I mean, what's the difference between special interests and interests? I mean, we all have interests, you know, so, you know, that was part of the genius, I think, of Madison, is that he saw that this is what it is. It's this kind of free-for-all. And his genius was figuring out a system that for a long time managed to balance these interests one against the other. So, it doesn't bother me that there are people who, you know, disagree with me, and, you know, they have their own, they want to get, you know, the government program for X, Y, or Z. You know, there are other people who want other things. So I'm not, you know, I know that the term special interest is sort of, it has a kind of a negative, existential negative sign in front of it. But I mean, maybe you have a, you know, a way of distinguishing between special interests, which are bad, presumably, and interests which at least are neutral. But
I'm referring to special interest as being a specific group.
Right.
That has their, perhaps it's a profession.
Right.
And it is in their interest, their economic interest, they are capable of presenting themselves, because the rest of us have got our own vocations that we have to follow.
Right. Well, so for example, the medical profession, that's a group.
Absolutely.
They have interests and so on. They haven't been very good about actually advancing their interests, in my opinion. But and you know, the drug companies, they have interests and so on. Well, sure, but then there are other elements in society that, you know, should help keep them honest. at the end of the day, there's a talk given by John Fletcher Moulton, Lord Moulton, who was a minister of armaments for a while in the First World War in Britain. Gave a talk in Boston, of all places. It was published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1924, I think. It was called Law and Manners. But in this talk, he articulated a very interesting principle, which he called obedience to the unenforceable. He said, all of social life takes place on this spectrum. From, at the one hand, whim. You can do whatever you want. On the other hand, it's governed by positive law. You must do this, you may not do that. And then, toward one end, there are things that, you can be almost free, but there's, some, social sanction that if you don't abide by convention. And the other end are things that are not quite illegal, but, you best not do them. But he said that there's this intermediate realm, a realm governed by the obedience to the unenforceable, the realm of convention and custom and manners and taste. And it's the extent and the vibrancy of that realm, he says, which is an index of the health of the civilization. And I think he's right about that. And he noted way back in the 20s, this was being eroded from both ends, sort of increasing anarchy on the one hand and increasing litigiousness and legalism and so on. And so if anything, both of those things have gotten worse. And it seems to me that, at the end of the day, we can't really rely on the law to do all of this. We need to rely on sort of civil society writ large. As Burke once said, the manners and morals are much more important than the law, because manners and morals touch us every day in every way, and all the way, the way in which we conduct our lives. The law touches us, just here and there, or at least it used to. So the real task, and it kind of comes back in a way to what I was saying about rhetoric, I think. The real task is to reinvigorate, that all of those virtues that congregate under that rubric: obedience to the unenforceable, taste, manners, conventions, custom. What can we do to make that part of our lives, better? I think Banquo's ghost is here to call an end to this. Anyway, thank you very much.
I want to thank you for being with us tonight. I always hate a lecture that has so much ambiguity in it. We start our year late this year. This is our first lecture. The next one will be January 23rd, and will feature Stephen Medema of the University of Colorado at Denver, who will be speaking from the School of Athens to the School of Chicago: Self-Interest, Market, and State in the History of Economic Ideas. We have a brochure out there where there is also a reception awaiting you. Hope you can stay with us and continue the conversation out there and be with us in the future. Thank you so much.